Hello from Adventure Isle. We are here aboard the Queen Mary where we are actually staying for a couple of days. But today, for this video specifically, we're going to give you an overview of what it's like to go on the Haunted Encounters tour aboard the Queen Mary in Long Beach. This is an hour-long tour that runs several times per day, and you can book these tours online. And if you do book the tour online, you do gain admission to the ship, and you are welcome to walk around the ship after you're done taking the tour. But we are going to go head for our tour now and share with you the details of what it's like to take a Haunted Encounters tour. And now let's take a tour and find out why the ship is haunted. The Haunted Encounters tour does have the same rules as all the other tours here aboard the Queen Mary, where you're not allowed to film the tour guide telling you any of the stories or history of the ship, but you are allowed to take notes and recount it yourself, which is what I will be doing here. Our tour guide started off by sharing some brief history about the Queen Mary. For example, she was built by the Cunard Line, and when the Cunard Line eventually ran out of funding to finish building her, the British government agreed to give them the funding they needed, but only if they would merge with the White Star Line, the line that was famous for owning the Titanic. The Queen Mary was built in the John Brown shipyard in Scotland, but she was just known as Job 534 until she was named at her christening, because it is bad luck to name a ship before the ship is christened. Once she was christened the Queen Mary, her first run was from Southampton, England to New York. Most of the time, the Queen Mary served as a Royal Mail ship and a passenger ship while she was at sea. However, she did spend 7 years serving the British government during World War II, where she was painted gray and known as the Grey Ghost. The Grey Ghost at the time did not have anything to do with the fact that she was haunted, but actually had to do with the fact that she was so fast that nobody could catch her. And after our quick history lesson, it was time for us to enter the Royal Wedding Chapel. And now, why is she haunted, and why are we in the Royal Wedding Chapel? So a little bit more history. There are 58 recorded deaths that happened on the Queen Mary during times of peace. They did not include deaths that happened during the time she served in the war, because those deaths are actually still sealed by the British government. But the first captain of Queen Mary stated that someone died approximately every 4 hours during the war. But it's actually the end of the war that ties in here to the Royal Chapel aboard the Queen Mary. Because when the war ended, the Queen Mary did not stop its service, but instead became what was called a bride and baby shuttle. And if you haven't heard of the term bride and baby shuttle, what it meant was that if an American soldier had gone over to Europe and got married, had a child, or fell in love while they were at service at war in Europe, they could bring those brides back to the U.S., and those brides would be given immediate U.S. citizenship. However, the catch was that the soldier had to be waiting to collect the bride when the ship landed in port, and if the soldier was not there, then the bride would be taken back and forth across the sea until hopefully one day the soldier would be waiting there to collect her. Because the soldier's bride could not come onto U.S. soil unless the soldier was there to get her. Now this ties directly into a soul that is said to haunt the Queen Mary. Her name is the Lady in White. And people believe that she haunts the ship because she was a bride who was never collected, so she stays on the ship waiting for her soldier. There are actually other theories that people believe about the Lady in White. A lot of people do believe in the story I just told you, where she was a bride that was never collected, but there are some that believe that possibly she was just a bride who got married on the Queen Mary, and it was such a happy memory for her that she likes to come back and visit, and it's up to you what you choose to believe about why the Lady in White hangs out on the Queen Mary. Once we were done with the history of the ship and learning about the Lady in White, it was time to head to the next haunted area of the ship, the isolation ward. Once we were given a bit of history about the isolation ward, it was easy to tell why people believe that this area of the ship is haunted. And not just haunted, but there are common reports from guests who visit the isolation ward area who say that they get sick, headaches, stomach pain, some even faint, and feel like they're getting sick from old viruses. Even our own guide said he will not go into the isolation ward area any farther than he has to because he gets migraines when he visits. And this was a pretty creepy feeling area on the ship, and let's talk about why, because the isolation ward had a very specific purpose. Guests who were sent down to the isolation room were normally sent for one of two reasons. The first reason was because they were sick and they did not want contagion to spread, so they would send guests down into the isolation area so that they would not spread any viruses, but they would have nurses down there to help them as well. If there were no sick guests, then nurses would just be in the normal area of the ship where crew would sleep, but if there were sick passengers, then the nurses would live down here in isolation with those passengers. But it would still be lonely for guests to stay down here in isolation away from their family and friends until they arrived at whatever their final destination was. And some of those guests who were sick aboard the ship also did not make it, and they would die down here in the isolation ward. Now, a sick guest was only the first kind of passenger that would end up in the isolation ward. The second kind of passenger that would end up in isolation ward would be any stowaways that were found aboard the ship. And it was even less fun for stowaways because if you were caught as a stowaway, you did not get to get off at the destination you were trying to stow away to. You had to, in fact, remain in isolation all the way to your first destination and then all the way back to the original destination where you boarded the ship without a ticket. And unfortunately, some people really could not handle the idea of being locked down here in isolation, so 2 of the passengers that were stowaways that were caught and put in isolation did take their own lives here in the isolation ward aboard the Queen Mary. And it's said that you can see 2 shadowy figures that haunt this area at night, and a lot of people believe that it is the 2 stowaways that took their own lives while they were living in isolation. After we were done in the isolation ward, it was time to head towards the most haunted stateroom on the ship, stateroom B340. This room was honestly made popular by YouTubers who filmed in there and created paranormal content, and it's a very well-known location, and supposedly all of the hauntings on the ship can be traced back to this one haunted stateroom. And there's really only very vague information about this stateroom and the person who died in there because there was no morgue on the Queen Mary and no way to tell how somebody died because autopsies were not done, which meant that the death records were very vague. So all we know about the man who died in B340 was that he was found dead in his bed, and the name of the spirit that haunts that room is Walter. There have been tons of reports of different paranormal activity that occurred in that room, but some of the most common things that have been reported are women who have the sheets pulled off of them at night and women having their hair pulled so hard that their head snaps back. But for a while, people actually really wanted to stay in that room. So for $1,000 a night, you could pay the Queen Mary to stay in that specific room, B340, and they would give you a Ouija board and a crystal ball, and it was an incredibly popular experience aboard the ship. But also, just to prove how haunted the room really was, people would call the lobby and ask the front lobby to please turn off the special effects in the room as they couldn't get any sleep, and that gives you an idea of just how active the spirits are in room B340. And now we've made it to the last stop on our Haunted Encounters tour, the first class pool. Unfortunately, it is not safe to enter the first class pool area any longer, but you are allowed to look through the doors, and there is a photo that you're going to see in just a second that does show what the first class pool looked like in the height of its glory. And not only is the pool gorgeous, but a lot of people who study paranormal activity actually believe that it's also the largest vortex on Queen Mary where the spirit world meets our world. And the most powerful spirit that inhabits this area is a 6 to 7-year-old little girl with blonde pigtails and a sailor dress, and her name is Jackie. People believe that the reason that Jackie inhabits this area is that she actually drowned on the ship, though reports actually say that she drowned in the second class pool, but she does haunt the first class pool. However, people who have seen Jackie also report that she does not just inhabit the pool area, but is actually one of the only spirits who has been seen both on and off the Queen Mary. There are multiple different reports that state people have seen Jackie off of the Queen Mary ship, but one of my favorite has to do with this dome that you see here off to the right-hand side of the ship, which used to hold the Spruce Goose. And it's reported that people used to say they would see Jackie walking on the wings of the Spruce Goose, and they would yell at her to get down, and she would jump off the wings of the airplane and vanish into thin air. And this is a total sidebar from the tour that we were on, but I was at Midsummer Scream Halloween Convention where they did have a setup for Dark Harbor, which is Queen Mary's Halloween event, and you can see here how popular Jackie is because she was actually the character that was out in front of their display, and she is regularly featured when the Queen Mary does Halloween events. Jackie is seen as a mischievous little girl who likes to play with other guests. She can often be heard giggling or playing peekaboo, and sometimes guests will say that if you start a nursery rhyme and she's around, she'll finish it for you. Obviously, as you know, a lot of people do think that the Queen Mary ship is haunted, and part of that, like what leads to that, is these hallways where the rooms are, where guests stay, because these hallways are not a straight line. They were actually built on a curve because the ship was built on a curve, and what that makes it look like is the hall never ends. They actually call these the endless hallways, and they're a little bit spooky because it looks like there's no end to where you're walking because it curves up over there so you can't see the end of the hallway. And that's it for us here at Adventure Isle at the Haunted Encounters Tour on the Queen Mary. I hope you enjoyed our video. I know we enjoyed making it and visiting the tour. And we're just going to leave you here with the Queen Mary's horn for a little bit of extra spookiness at the end of this video.